Welcome to the History of Being Human podcast and YouTube channel. Note to the podcast listeners, if you want to see what I'm talking about sometimes, you can follow the link in the show notes below, of course, after you listen to the entire episode. And you can see the images that I refer to when I'm talking. I think it will make sense to you if you're just listening. I'll make every effort to explain what I'm talking about. But if you do want to see the slides, this is a lecture that I had given to a group of individuals previously, and I decided to turn it into an episode. Today, featherless bipeds. The premise of this episode is fairly simple. Being bipedal, walking upright on 2 feet, is key to understanding who we are, how we developed, and what we're capable of. If you don't recognize the term featherless bipeds, it goes all the way back to the 4th century BC. Plato himself defined humans as featherless bipeds. At his academy, of course, he's celebrated for this definition because the Greeks loved the most concise and the most parsimonious definition of anything. So, for example, when Aristotle says that happiness is an activity of the soul in accordance with excellence, he's celebrated for that. Well, Plato was celebrated for his definition at the academy of human beings as featherless bipeds. But there's a famous anecdote told about that Diogenes the cynic, which to us would be a troll, Diogenes the troll heard about Plato's definition, plucked a chicken, brought it to the academy and said, "Behold Plato's man." So Plato had to change his definition from featherless bipeds to featherless bipeds with broad, flat nails. Now that doesn't seem like an adequate description of being human. And you might wonder why Plato chose those traits to identify us by. But the point of this lecture is he was on to something, because being bipedal is key to who we are. If you look at the short list of things that set us apart, say the elevator pitch of what it means to be human, we would say we have large brains. We have opposable thumbs, very dexterous, fine motor control. We are able to form complex societies. We have a complicated language which allows us to bear culture from one generation to another. Well, being upright on 2 feet, obligate bipedalism, both preceded and might have been a key step in the development of all those other capabilities. Before there were large brains, there was bipedalism. Before there were complicated societies, much culture to even bear from generation to generation, there was bipedalism. Before there were dexterous hands with fine motor control, there was bipedalism. This quote from the Journal of Anatomy is representative. In terms of human evolution in the broader context, it's now generally considered that the development of obligate bipedal locomotion was one of the most significant adaptations to occur within the hominin lineage. When did bipedalism first develop? Now, I'm not talking about reptile or dinosaur or bird bipedalism. That was millions of years before there was hominin bipedalism. I'm talking about hominin bipedalism. Just a word about that. Hominins with an N at the end. I'm talking about us and our closest relatives, a group of which we are the last representatives remaining on the planet. Not very enduring, long-lived species, unfortunately, I hate to say it. But one of the oldest, probably bipedal fossils is shown in the slide here. And if you can't see it on the podcast, it is Sahelanthropus chadensis. 9 cranial specimens were unearthed of this species in 2001 in the Sahel region of Chad, hence the name. I just call it Satchel Chad. 9 cranial specimens, and from that, scientists believe that this was a bipedal organism. Why is that? Well, it has to do with the foramen magnum, the opening on the underside of the skull that the spinal cord exits from. And there are 2 specific features of the foramen magnum, that opening in the skull of Sahelanthropus, that indicate it was most likely upright, most likely bipedal. If you look at the graph above shows how centrally located the foramen magnum is among different species. And if you can't see it on the podcast, I'll explain. The human foramen magnum is 1/3 of the way from the back of the skull to the front of the skull. The gorilla foramen magnum is only about 10 to 15% of the way from the back of the skull to the front of the skull. In other words, the human foramen magnum, the human spinal cord, exits the brainstem much closer to the center of mass of the skull. So that's better for balancing an upright skull on a vertical column. That indicates that we walk upright, vertically. If you look at the foramen magnum of animals that walk on four legs, it is located at the back of the skull. And not only is it located at the back of the skull, but the foramen magnum of quadrupeds points backwards. So Sahelanthropus chadensis had a vertically oriented, near the center of mass located foramen magnum. That hole under the skull seems to indicate Sahelanthropus was walking upright on 2 feet. Now, in 2022, more evidence of the upright walking posture of Sahelanthropus came to light. At the time, all the way back in 2001, when the skull fragments were identified, a femur, which is in the left on this slide, a femur specimen, and also 2 ulnas, so 2 forearm specimens, were identified in the same area. They weren't sure they belonged to Sahelanthropus, but no other species has been discovered in that area. So now this femur is associated with those skull fragments. And this femur is more evidence that Sahelanthropus was bipedal. Why is that? Because they have this obturator groove. One of their muscle attachments on the femur is consistent with walking upright. Chimpanzees don't have it. Human beings do. Upright bipedal creatures have an obturator groove. Sahelanthropus had an obturator groove. So more evidence that this may have been an obligate bipedal, a creature that could and had to walk upright on 2 feet. Another possibly ancestral hominin, the Millennium Man as we called him in our episode. This is Auroran tugenensis, found in the region of Tugen in Kenya. Auroran means original man. This is a very ancient specimen of a femur, 6 million years old. This rocked the world of anthropology for a couple of reasons. One is it seems that this femur, if you look at the femoral neck, both its orientation, its size, its angulation, and you look at the head of the femur, it's small, it's round. This is a bipedal femur, at least the head and neck. Strong evidence of bipedalism. A 6 million year old specimen. But what was really unsettling is it is more closely modern human in its orientation and shape than that of Lucy, a creature that's much younger, 4 million years ago. So everybody assumed that Lucy was our ancestor, but now Auroran has cast doubt on that. It's thought that maybe Auroran tugenensis was the ancestor of Homo erectus and hence modern humans. Lucy might have been a branch from the tree that ended up just dying out, dropping off. But the take home on this is that here's strong evidence of bipedal gait in a creature that otherwise had many ape-like features 6 million years ago in Kenya. So while there is evidence that 7 million years ago Sahelanthropus is bipedal, 6 million years ago Auroran is bipedal, 1,800 miles away from where the Sahelanthropus fossils were found, we have this, one of the most haunting, beautiful images in all of prehistory and history. A group of Yale paleontologists working with Mary Leakey, the one who discovered the Lucy fossils, is working in the Olduvai Gorge region of Tanzania. They're horsing around. One of them throws elephant dung at the other one, who ducks to miss the elephant dung and ends up falling down. He comes face to face with these footprints, almost human footprints. As they clean them up and identify them, they find 80 feet of footprints made by creatures, 2 or 3 adults, it's hard to say which because they followed in each other's footprints, and a small child, walking through a field of wet volcanic ash 3.7 million years ago. These prints become fossilized, and they are the oldest definitive proof of bipedal locomotion in the hominin line. They are made by Australopithecus afarensis. Those of you who can see the slide at the top left is an artist's representation of what that might have looked like. The Laetoli prints bear striking similarities to modern human gait, but they're morphologically distinct from the modern human foot. There's more pressure on the heel. There's less evidence of propulsion from the ball of the foot, so they probably didn't have a locking midfoot in the same way that modern humans do, that allowed them to drive and propel themselves forward off the ball of their foot. They probably walked with a more bent knee. So even though they were bipedal and very close to modern human gait, it wasn't modern human gait. It was less efficient. Walking with a bent knee is less efficient. They would have had to expend more energy to get the same distance than a modern human. I said earlier that bipedal gait came before large brains. Well, this slide is just there to drive that home. If you can't see the slide, it's a slide showing cranial capacity over time. Around 2.5 million years ago is when cranial capacity began to expand rapidly. Those prints, those Laetoli prints, were 3.7 million years old, long before large brains, large cranial capacity. Of course, cranial capacity is just how much brain can you stuff into a skull. Long before that began to expand, Australopithecus was walking upright on 2 feet. Around 2.5 million years ago, human brain size began to expand dramatically, probably due to a combination of factors, but many of those factors were tied to walking upright on 2 feet, bipedalism. The ability to travel farther, more efficiently, means you have to assimilate new terrain. You have to adapt to different conditions. When you're not loping around on your knuckles and you don't need the strong stability of a more rigid wrist and hand, you develop more flexible wrists and hands. If you can bring food home to the tribe in something besides your mouth, you can carry more. So you can have larger social networks, larger groups. And all of those adaptations depend on being bipedal. And so this period of brain expansion and obligate bipedalism coincided with the emergence of the genus Homo, the genus to which we belong. And that genus began with the Homo habilis, the handyman, around 2.3 million years ago. If you look at the foot on the right, the foot of Homo habilis very closely resembles the foot of a modern Homo sapiens. This is also, by the way, one of the more haunting images in prehistory, because if you look at the talus of this specimen, which my picture is partially occluding, but if you look at the talus down here, you can see crocodile teeth marks on this foot bone. So terrifying image. We can only hope that the crocodile teeth were made post-mortem instead of the cause of death. We know also that by 1.5 million years ago, gait was essentially the same as modern human. We know that because of these prints from Kenya, from Homo erectus, the OG, as I said, the greatest generation of hominin. They were on the planet for almost 2 million years. If you're generous, you could say we've been here around 300,000 years. We have to be on the planet over 1.5 million more years before we are nearly as enduring as Homo erecti were. But Homo erectus, if you look at these prints, they're almost indistinguishable from modern humans. They have a locking midfoot. They're able to propel, to push off the ball of their foot and their big toe, to drive them forward much more efficiently. They're almost the same size as modern human prints, and they were much more closely aligned with our knee mechanics than, say, Australopithecus. It cost Homo erectus far fewer calories relative to the distance that it traveled than Australopithecus, or even Homo habilis. But along with this much more efficient, effective gait came a whole host of capabilities. If you can't see this slide, on the top right, I have a picture of the range of Homo erectus. It goes all the way from Great Britain in the north, throughout Africa, Saudi Arabia, India, China, even down into Indonesia. This is a vast range. This means they had to adapt to a great variation of terrain, climate. They had to be able to think in new ways. They were the first species to harness fire, to our knowledge. That allowed them to get much more nutritional value out of their food. So of course, social groups could become larger. Larger social groups corresponds to an increase in the size of your frontal lobe. Think about how much of your thinking during the day has to do with your interaction, your relationship with one human or another. And so it's not surprising then that the brain of the upright man, Homo erectus, is close to the size of the modern human brain. Modern human cranial vault, about 1,350 cc's. Homo erectus, 1,100 cc's. So the question naturally arises, why did bipedalism develop? It's fairly costly. If you look at the costs of bipedalism, there are several. One is that there's a long learning curve to learn to walk. It takes humans on average about a year, give or take a couple months, to even be able to walk on 2 feet. And even then, if you know toddlers, they can barely get around. Keeping up isn't even a question. So there's a longer period of helplessness. There are increased stresses on the back, the knee, the foot. So injuries are very common. And these injuries can be very costly. You think about if you're a hunter-gatherer and you have a fractured thigh, how are you going to support yourself? You have to be taken care of by other members of your social group. Otherwise, it's game over. If you fractured your femur, you're done. But there's evidence in ancient fossils of people recovering from fractured femurs. So we know people were taking care of each other millions of years ago, but it's still costly. Humans have a lot of sinus infections because upright posture leads to our sinuses needing to drain against gravity, which isn't very efficient. Hernias are very common in humans, not in other animals, not in quadrupeds. Childbirth is a very costly activity for humans. But I do want to take just a minute to dispel what I consider a myth. That is the myth that about half of all the women in history died in childbirth. According to the best demographic evidence, maybe 5 to 6% of women who had multiple childbirths died as a result of that. Every childbirth, though, was dangerous. You had a 1 or 2 in 100 chance of dying during childbirth. And that has to do with bipedalism. Have to have a narrower, more rigid pelvis. And so birth, which should be the most easy, natural thing ever, became very costly also because of bipedalism. So with all of these costs, why was bipedalism adaptive? Why did it develop? What advantages did it confer on early hominins? Depending on how you count them, there's somewhere between 10 and 20 theories about why bipedalism developed. This is the first one. This came around the time of Darwin, and this is the savanna hypothesis. That is that during the Miocene epoch, forests are receding, the savanna is advancing, and that led to the development of bipedalism. The thought is that you have new ecological niches, and the ape-like creatures that inhabited the trees didn't fare very well in the open plains. If you stand upright, you can see over the brush, you can see predators coming, you can see prey that you want to capture, and so walking upright was naturally adaptive. This whole idea kind of hit a snag when researchers started digging up early upright hominins, bipedal hominins in other words, that were still living in the forest. So then people started saying, well, upright walking is the best way to travel between clumps of trees. That's why some early hominins had upright walking features with ape-like arms, because they had to walk from tree to tree. That's the best way that they could get around during this changing environment. So that's the savanna hypothesis. Now, I can't possibly mention every theory, obviously, but I want to point this one out. This is called the amphibian generalist theory, and it replaced the much mocked and maligned aquatic ape theory. The aquatic ape theory was kind of interesting. It came out in the 60s, and the theory said, well, look, whales and sea mammals have subcutaneous fat. Land creatures don't really have that, but humans have subcutaneous fat. We might have developed in the water. Also, we don't have hair. Land creatures have hair, humans don't. Maybe the hair slows you down when you're swimming, so that's more evidence that we were aquatic. Humans have a descended larynx. Land creatures don't have that. Sea mammals have a descended larynx. So humans have a descended larynx. All of this adds up to the fact that maybe we developed in aquatic environments and then crawled out onto the land. Now, arguing against that is bipedalism itself. There aren't a lot of whales or seals that are bipedal. And also the environment that early humans developed in wasn't really aquatic. So that theory came into great disrepute. And the amphibian generalist theory is an upgrade of that. The amphibian generalist theory tries to hold on to some of the insights of the aquatic ape theory, but also make it a little bit more relevant to the reality of our evolution. So during the 1990s, Clark and Tobias reported that the fossil record showed that bipedalism developed in a forested habitat. And moreover, this was an area that was full of streams, pools, rivers, so half aquatic. No longer were we the aquatic ape, we're now the wading ape. That bipedalism began as a way to wade from place to place to keep our heads above water, and that certainly is possible. Also, freeing our hands. Many of these theories can work together. Whether we developed in a savanna or a forested environment, having the use of free hands was certainly an advantage. There's a theory called the killer ape hypothesis, that hominins developed in a state of perpetual Hobbesian warfare. And so having free hands allowed us to bash each other with rocks, poke each other with sticks, and fight much more efficiently. Standing upright is also just good policy when you're in a fight. I mean, look at grizzly bears. They rear up on their haunches when they're about to fight. Any animal that can rear up on its hind legs does so when it's about to fight. And there may be reasons for that, such as trying to intimidate your opponent, but also just sheer physics. If you've ever tried to hammer a nail into a ceiling, you know that that's much harder, that you can't exert as much force or maintain it for as long as when you're trying to hammer a nail into the floor. We're much more capable of striking downward than upward. So that's the killer ape hypothesis. Whether you ascribe to the killer ape hypothesis or not, There's no doubt that our hands are crucial to who we are and what we're capable of. Look at this slide if you're on the YouTube video. If you're on the podcast, I'll explain it to you. At the bottom, there's what's called a homunculus. Homunculus means little man, and it's a representation of how much of our neurons are devoted to a specific area of our body. A huge proportion of our cranial neurons devoted to movement are devoted to moving our hands. That's why we can play guitar, play piano, but even more importantly for the survival of our ancestors, that's why they could fashion tools. That's why they could build things. And fine motor control wouldn't be possible if we weren't bipedal. I've already alluded to this. When you need to shuffle around on your knuckles, when you need to walk on your hands, they can't be flexible. There's a trade-off between stability and flexibility. And the more flexible your hands are, the more flexible your shoulder is, the less stable it is. When you need the stability of quadrupedal gait, you don't have the dexterity. Bipedalism allowed us to become who we are. One advantage from having our hands free, which I haven't mentioned yet, is really like a superpower. It is a huge advantage that we have over other animals. That is the ability to throw things. I have a slide here about why chimps don't play baseball. Chimps don't play baseball because they can only throw a baseball 20 miles an hour. They can't throw a baseball as fast or as accurately as a 7-year-old human. A 95-mile-an-hour fastball, forget about it. Human beings can throw spears, rocks, balls better than any other creature on the planet. And that has to do with our amazing shoulder, which is probably another episode. Our shoulder can move at 9,000 degrees a second. The fastest motion that the human body is capable of making is shoulder rotation during throwing. And that's a huge advantage. You don't assume nearly as much risk of injury if you can stand away from something and throw rocks at it to either kill it, drive it away, whatever it is. So the ability to throw, the throwing ape hypothesis, is clearly, in my mind, one of the strong advantages, one of the strong adaptations that came from being bipedal. Now, I have to admit, I've been talking us up pretty highly. I've been blowing a lot of sunshine at our abilities. But let's pause for just a moment to think about what bipedalism didn't give us the ability to do. And one of the things that bipedalism does not confer upon us is speed. We're really incredibly slow creatures. Usain Bolt, either the fastest human in history or just the fastest human in recorded history, has reached speeds over 25 miles an hour. The average, very fast, young adult human can run between 15 and 18 miles an hour. That's pathetic in the animal kingdom. Usain Bolt cannot outrun a house cat in a 100-meter dash. He can't outrun a dog, well, some species of dogs. But take, for example, the African wild dog. The African wild dog might have been a competitor or predator on early hominins, who knows? That African wild dog can run 45 miles per hour. It's as fast as the fastest greyhound. The average chimpanzee can run 25 miles an hour, as fast as Usain Bolt. That's just the average chimpanzee. Tigers can run at 40 miles an hour. Lions have been clocked at 50 miles an hour. Leopards, who might have been one of the most dangerous predators of early hominins, run 35 to 40 miles an hour, climb trees much better than we did. So the point of this, I think, is well taken. Speed is not the reason that we developed bipedalism. We are not fast creatures. Watching humans race is roughly the equivalent in the big picture as watching a tortoise race. But what we lack in speed, we make up for in the ability to cover long distances. Humans can run very, very long distances. That opened opportunities for what's called persistence hunting. Simply running an animal until it can't run anymore, collapses from exhaustion, and then you can kill it and bring it home. But I also want to correct a very common myth. I might have even said this before, that humans can run longer distance than any other creature on the planet because we're so great at dissipating heat. That, unfortunately, is not true. We are not the greatest endurance athletes in the animal kingdom. No matter what the book Born to Run says about it, it's false. So take, for example, an ostrich. An ostrich could run a marathon in about 45 minutes, 26.2 miles. The fastest human in history takes 2 hours to run a marathon. This is the average ostrich. The average pronghorn could run the same marathon in about 45 minutes, could stop and rest for an hour and 15 minutes before the fastest human in history ever even caught up to it. Talking about just day in and day out endurance, try racing a Tarahumara Indian against a camel. Camels can go 200 miles in a single day with a human on their back. So I defy any human to be able to match that distance. Nevertheless, the point remains that we can go a very long distance, much longer than most other animals. This would have been an adaptive trait that we could cover so much distance. And this brings me to a related point. We weren't just born to walk. We don't just have the ability to walk upright bipedally. We have the ability to run. We were literally born to run. We have long tendons which store rebound energy, so you don't have to exert nearly as much muscle force to propel yourself forward. The rebound elasticity of your tendons will do that for you. We have 20 miles worth of glycogen stored. We have a straight great toe, which pushes us forward effectively, efficiently, but also shorter toes. If you increase toe length by 20%, your foot has to work twice as hard to propel you off that toe. So that's bad news for all of you with the long, graceful toes, and better news for those of you with short, what we call peasant foot, with the short, stubby toes. More efficient in propelling you forward. Along with that, we have large glutes. Those glutes are much larger than they need to be just to walk around. They were also born to run. Your glutes are much more activated in running than they are in walking around. And finally, we have a narrow waist, narrow hips, so that we stay over our center of mass and proceed in a direct straight line forward, instead of having to shuffle side to side like a speed skater. Now, most of what I've been covering so far is descriptive. I'm going to now shift to the normative. You might want to tune out. I'm going to argue that it's very important that we actually do bipedalism, that we use our abilities to get around. If you look at the Paleolithic lifestyle and compare it to what we would call the modern Western lifestyle, there is a much higher level of physical activity. 15 to 18,000 steps per day on average. Human beings require less sleep in a hunter-gatherer society. Chimpanzees require 9.5 hours of sleep a night. Humans, about 7. Now, I know you've heard about 8 hours of sleep a night. I've heard it all my life. But if you look at the actual data, how much human beings actually sleep, it's closer to 7 hours of sleep a night. But what I want to point out, total energy expenditure is about the same cross-culturally among human groups. Physiologists don't understand it yet. Hunter-gatherer societies who walk 18,000 steps a day tend to burn about the same amount of calories in a day as Western couch potatoes. What that tells them is their resting metabolic rate must be much lower. So what matters is not just how many calories you burn, but how you burn them. You really need to burn your calories through physical activities as a human, and I'll explain why. On the left of this slide, there's a picture of just an average guy, normal guy, a modern sedentary human. He probably walks about 3,000 steps per day. He might exercise 2 or 3 times a week. 28% body fat on the average, probably. Now on the right, we have a chimp named Oliver. Oliver sits around pretty much all day. He sleeps longer, he moves less than the man on the left, expends fewer calories than the man on the left, eats mostly vegetables and monkey chow. As Oliver ages, he's not going to get diabetes, unlike many humans. His blood pressure isn't going to go up with age, unlike most humans. His cholesterol level is going to be high, but that high cholesterol level won't result in hardening of Oliver's arteries. He won't get arteriosclerosis like humans do. Also, he won't have coronary artery disease. He won't get it. He may get a fibrous heart disease, totally different, but he doesn't need physical activity to stave off diabetes, obesity, cholesterol plaques in his arteries, heart disease, and even depression and anxiety. When human beings don't move, our rates of depression and anxiety are much higher. Oliver's body fat is that of an elite Olympic athlete. 10% body fat. It's very unfair. Even silverback gorillas, those gorillas that we think look fat, they have that big belly, they only have about 20% body fat on average, which is equivalent to a slender human being. Human beings are not like Oliver the chimp. We don't do well when we're sedentary. A whole host of ills befall us. Depression, anxiety, heart disease, artery disease, all cause mortality. In fact, inflammation levels go way up. When women are sedentary, there's an increase of interleukin-6, which is a pro-inflammatory mediator. When men are sedentary, we have a decrease of interleukin 10, which is an anti-inflammatory mediator. So in both cases, men and women who are sedentary, our level of inflammation goes up. So like I said, it isn't fair, but it is reality. According to this quote from Dr. Ponzer, we have long known that exercise is good for us humans. We are only beginning to appreciate the myriad ways our physiology has adapted to the physically active way of life. Nearly every organ system is implicated, down to the cellular level. I've only listed a few of the ways that exercise is necessary for us. So maybe in this analysis, the take-home message is, yeah, it's great to be bipedal, but it also comes with a strong imperative that we do bipedalism. And let me give you just one piece of evidence, I think very strong evidence of this, that you have to do bipedalism. This is a cardiology journal, recent study, 2023. 227,000 people in different studies. They did a meta-analysis, and all they did is very simple. How many steps do you take a day? What is your risk of dying of anything? So what they call all-cause mortality. And what is your risk of cardiovascular mortality? They found that there is a significant decrease in your risk of dying beginning around 4,000 steps per day. So all you have to do is take 4,000 steps a day, and you're much less likely to die of anything than people who take fewer steps. As far as cardiac death goes, all you have to do is take 2,400 steps a day, and your risk of cardiovascular mortality drops. Now here's the thing that's kind of encouraging but also kind of daunting. There doesn't seem to be an upper limit on the benefits up to 20,000 steps a day. You would be less likely to die of any cause if you take 20,000 steps a day than if you take 18,000 steps a day. So we don't know what that upper limit is. All the way up to 20,000 steps a day, you can lower your risk of dying of heart disease or of anything at all simply by being active, by taking more steps.